Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside of Studio North. Joined now by Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek is the author most recently of Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. He's a graduate of Harvard College, of Yale Law School, which is pretty good for a kid from Cincinnati, especially a St. X kid. Very successful biotech investor, now runs Strive. Of course, he is best known for sustained attacks on woke ideology and for his very surprising 2024 campaign. He's in third place if you use the Real Clear Politics. He's in second place if you use some regular polls. Vivek, welcome back. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Hugh. How are you?
I'm great. Now, I've already told the audience we chatted on Friday. You did not want a pre-interview. I want people to know that. But I always talk to candidates so that they're not ambushed by me. We had a good conversation. This is a national security interview. But let me begin by saying you're going to the Nixon Library on Friday in Yorba Linda to give a speech about national security. Why did you pick my favorite presidential library?
Well, I think it commemorated my foreign policy vision, Hugh. I'm actually going to really reorient our foreign policy away from the model of liberal hegemony back to a model of actual, I would say, protection of the homeland, a modern Monroe Doctrine. But a big part of my strategy is to pull Russia out of its military alliance with China. Russia, China together outmatch the U.S. in every area of major competition. Hypersonic missile capabilities ahead of that of the U.S., a larger nuclear stockpile in Russia's case, naval capabilities in many ways that exceed ours in China's. I know that's something we can debate, but together they outmatch the U.S. And so what I want to do is the reverse maneuver of what Nixon did in 1972. What did Nixon do? He pulled Mao Zedong out of Brezhnev-led USSR's hands. Right now, I believe Putin is like the new Mao. Did we trust Mao then? No, we did not. Should we trust Putin now? No, we do not. But we can trust each of them not to actually follow their own self-interest. And so that's how I plan to end the Ukraine war. Do a deal that, yes, does give Putin concessions, but in return for requiring Vladimir Putin to exit his military partnership with China. And there are echoes of Nixon's diplomacy in 1972 that I thought the best place to do this was actually at the Nixon Presidential Library itself. And so we'll be going into far greater depth, Hugh, but that just gives you a sense for why we chose that as the location to do it.
Well, we can go into great depth here because we're not rushed. And I don't want to rush. We're going to play what we don't play on the air today, tomorrow on the program, so we don't have to rush. I want to ask, though, you're going out to Nixon land in Yorba Linda as we approach the 50th anniversary of what I think is Richard Nixon's greatest foreign policy accomplishment, the Yom Kippur War. Yes. Is that something with which you're familiar and how he acted there?
I am, though that was not part of the inspiration for my actual going to the Nixon Library. It was more the reverse maneuver with respect to China. That's my focus.
When Israel was on the ropes in 1973, Nixon said, send everything that can fly. We didn't have a treaty obligation to do so, but he did. And he saved them from the invasion by the Syrians, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians. How is that different from sending everything that can fly, not men, not soldiers, not women, not Marines, but weaponry is what Nixon sent to Israel in 73, 50 years ago. I gather you want to cut that off to Ukraine now if Putin will do a deal.
I do, if it's a deal that advances American interests. And Hugh, it's a great question on your part, but I believe not in just analogizing, but actually analyzing each situation uniquely. I think that Nixon did make the right decision then, but that doesn't mean that copying that in the situation of Ukraine, where our interests in Ukraine are, I think, even very different than our interests in Israel. So it's not that, yes, both were not treaty allies. That's true. But I have yet to hear an articulated interest of why it is in our national interest of the U.S. to actually go to further length here in Ukraine. I believe we have already fulfilled our obligations under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. To the contrary, I think we are in further violation of James Baker's commitment to Gorbachev in 1990 that NATO would expand not 1 inch, his famous words, which you will remember well, not 1 inch past Germany. And yet NATO has expanded now more following the fall of the USSR than when the USSR ever existed. And so I do think that there is a weird juxtaposition here brought up with respect to one 1994 non-treaty memorandum, which I believe we've already fulfilled, when in fact in many more ways we're flagrantly out of line on prior commitments we've made in the other end. Now, with respect to Ukraine in particular, I think that we are actually driving Russia further into China's arms. And this is the biggest difference from prior situations, Hugh. This actually impedes the U.S. national interest because that Russia-China alliance, and I'm disappointed, I have to say, that nobody in either major party is really talking about it, but that Russia-China alliance is the single greatest threat, single greatest military threat that we face today. And one of my top objectives in my foreign policy, in my presidency, will be to weaken, if not to outright pull apart, that Russia-China alliance. The good news is Putin and Xi Jinping, they're not actually in a super friendly relationship with one another. They put on a good act, but you got to double click and look at the details. After that 2022 strategic no limits partnership, the dirty little secret is that Vladimir Putin sells weapons both to India and to Vietnam one day or within days afterwards, sending a signal that, you know what, Vladimir Xi Jinping is not going to like that very much, but he did it anyway. China in its northeast region still can't build a railroad to access the sea. That leaves the northeast portion of China economically behind because Vladimir Putin is standing in the way with the strip of Russian land that he won't let them run over. And so there are cracks in that veneer. There are cracks in that armor. This is our moment to take advantage of that by, yes, doing a deal. And in any good deal, somebody has to come out with the win. For Putin, I think the win is manageable for the United States. Freezing the current lines of control in a Korean War-style armistice agreement. Further making a hard commitment that NATO will not admit Ukraine to NATO. By the way, a simple commitment that's, to say the least, consistent with Baker's commitment to Gorbachev in 1990. Not to mention the basic thing we could do after Angela Merkel's disastrous comments that the Minsk agreement was somehow just a matter of biding time. Yes, these are basic commitments the U.S. can make that do give Putin some wins that he wants. And I would even reopen economic relations with Russia. Against that backdrop, though, I will require Putin to exit his military alliance with China, remove the Russian military presence from the West, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and I would also require him to move the nuclear weapons from Kaliningrad, the strip of Russia that borders Poland. That is a win for the U.S. It is a win for Russia. And while the following is more debatable, I think we could even argue that it could be at least a stable outcome, if not even something of a win for Ukraine, which comes out with its sovereignty intact in a deal backstopped not just by Ukraine, but with U.S. interests backstopping it. That is
now,
how
I want to remind the audience.
It's
an interview, not a debate. So I'm not arguing with Vivek. I'm asking questions that arise. One of the things you just said, Vivek Ramaswamy, that I caught is that we've gone beyond the Secretary Baker commitments in 1990. Obviously, Poland and Romania are members of NATO now, as are now Finland and Sweden. Are you suggesting they be expelled from NATO?
No, I'm not. But I'm just making an observation that there is a discrepancy, Hugh, between the somehow recently discovered fetishization of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when just 4 years earlier there was a separate commitment that the entire establishment that fetishizes the 1994 memorandum doesn't once mention. And so it's just context to look at those commitments, especially against the backdrop of my belief that we have indeed fulfilled our obligations, the U.S. obligations, to that 1994.
What would you say to someone who would point out that Secretary Baker's commitment was not in writing and that they gave up nothing to get that? So a contract. You're a Yale Law School graduate. I believe they taught failure of consideration at Yale. Not sure. It's Yale Law School. I'm not sure what they teach there. But Ukraine gave us all their. That's a good point. Yeah, Ukraine gave us all their nuclear weapons. That is a consideration. That's a reliance damage. Isn't that different from 1990?
Well, first of all, and you know this, Hugh, well, we're not talking about contracts here. Contracts between nations of the highest order are codified in treaty. The Budapest Memorandum was not a treaty. Neither was actually the commitment made to Gorbachev. But this is part of diplomacy, a reliance on U.S. commitments and our credibility going forward. And so I do think that those were entered in the same period, in the same geopolitical post-Cold War or immediately ending the Cold War context. And so, yes, I do think that there is a vast disparity where, I mean, you can just take this as an example. Who other than me is even bringing up the 1990 commitment made by Baker to Gorbachev? Basically, in both political parties, the answer is no one, really. And yet, how many times has the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, non-treaty agreement, but non-treaty nonetheless, been brought up in the context of the Ukraine war? So I'm pointing out that disparity to say that at the end of the day, we have to come back and ask, What
when you get out to Yorba Linda, when you get out there, I'm
president.
sure Jim Byron will take you around. You're going to see that Nixon is a Navy man, a combat veteran. Not really. He was in a combat zone, but he wasn't a shooter. He was on the logistics side, way out in the Pacific. James Baker, a Marine veteran. George H.W. Bush, an aviator. This raises a fundamental question. In this race, Governor DeSantis is the only veteran. Nikki Haley is the spouse of a deployed soldier. Mike Pence is the father of a deployed airman and the father-in-law of a deployed airman, fighter pilots. Do you think you have what it takes to be the commander-in-chief? Now, I asked this question to Ben Carson during the debates in 2016, got booed because people were suggesting I thought he was soft. And I'm just saying, and I'm not. I'm just saying, have you thought about having to pull the trigger on decisions that cost American lives? And can you do it if it's necessary?
The answer to that question, I believe the question is a fair one, Hugh. The answer to that question is decisively yes. And in fact, I think I'm going to be best positioned to do it because I'm unencumbered by a lot of our history of making, I think, poor decisions over the last 25 years. To be clear, let's take what I view as certainly the two greatest presidents in modern history when it comes to our foreign policy, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. Neither of them served in the military. Neither of them had spouses serving in the military. Both of them did have private sector experience that allowed them to more effectively do deals than presidents who didn't have that same private sector experience. And so what I'm bringing to the table is, I think, a fresh perspective. But yes, I think you and I had a discussion, 4 or 5 months ago. I think, if I may say it myself, I think I'm much further along than I was 5 months ago. And I am confident that by the time I take the White House, I will be further along than anybody in either the Republican or Democrat field in terms of the raw knowledge to take on this role, but armed with something that nobody else has, which is a fresh perspective on actually how I'll reorient our foreign policy towards defending the homeland itself. This is the big picture, to not lose the forest for the trees, Hugh. Our national defense spending and our national defense focus has not yet focused for the last 25 years enough on actually defense, defending the homeland itself. You and I talked about the nuclear triad before. I think that needs to be a nuclear quad. Where are we bringing space-based capabilities in? I don't think we're having enough of a discussion about that. I favor reviving Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI. Our missile defense capabilities are really antiquated. They're non-existent for all intents and purposes, certainly against hypersonic missiles, which are actually more relevant today. Super EMP attacks, cyber attacks, beyond just nuclear attacks. These are also significant sources of vulnerability that could cost American lives, not just lives in the military, but even civilian lives here at home. And I think it is somewhat shameful, Hugh, that this is not at the forefront of the conversation in not just the Republican Party, but in our politics. And so that brings me back to the point that, yes, it does take an outsider with a fresh perspective and intellectual humility and curiosity, but an intellectual commitment to get to the bottom of it, but also executive experience, including from the private sector, to do the kinds of deals, to bring the kind of diplomacy to secure peace in the 21st century.
Now, former President Trump made the same argument in 2016. He also had a problem with the triad, and he told me, I'll know what I need to know when I need to know it. And he did when he took out, for example, Soleimani. So he did what he, but among an administration of many successes, most specifically his 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, his biggest failure, and I don't think anyone disagrees with this, was to rebuild the American Navy as he promised, not once, not twice, but 3 times, most memorably at Philadelphia Shipyard. The Navy has not improved. It is in dire need of recapitalization and redeployment. How would you get it fixed, Vivek Ramaswamy, and what would your goal, your metric be for measuring progress?
So look, I think that the number one mistake we've made, and it doesn't just fall at Trump's feet, but I do agree that this is one of the areas where I would do things differently in building on the foundation he laid to take us forward, is end this divest to invest program. I understand the logic, but I think it leaves us vulnerable precisely in the period at the nadir of our capacity when China will be potentially best primed to go after Taiwan before we've even achieved semiconductor independence. So for me, this isn't just a theoretical point to say under all conditions, our Navy has to look like a certain number. And, I do think we need at least 400, 450 plus, in terms of just basic capacity of ships to counter China's naval capacity and naval fleet, which is actually larger than ours today. But I don't think that those top down, in theory, across time and space, answers are the right ones. I think the right answers are what matter today. The top U.S. interest today, where our naval capacity shortages actually leave us vulnerable, is indeed in the case of Taiwan. We are dependent on a tiny island nation off the southeast coast of China for our entire modern way of life in the United States of America. I think many Americans need to internalize that fact. We would not live a modern lifestyle if it were not for the global semiconductor supply chains, specifically leading edge advanced semiconductors that come from Taiwan. That's a great vulnerability for us, especially as we enter a period where I believe China is likely to make a move to annex Taiwan in the next decade. I think that's a real threat that we face, and our naval shortcoming, our naval capacity shortcoming, is one of the big vulnerabilities that makes that more likely to happen. So
Vivek,
I believe in
I
offering
asked
strategic
a Marine,
clarity here.
I asked a Marine general officer retired yesterday in anticipation of our conversation, how would he phrase this question? And his response to me was very specific. Ask Vivek, would you fire the first shot? If they move against Taiwan and they have not hit American assets, would you fire the first shot? Because that means general war in the Western Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. And if you fire the first shot, do you think we're in a position to win that conflict?
So here's the deeper answer to that question. There is a difference between we have before semiconductor independence and afterwards. My response changes dramatically depending on that. So one of my objectives is by the end of my first term, I believe I will lead us towards semiconductor independence. During that time, I'm going to be very clear, move from strategic ambiguity in Taiwan to strategic clarity, where I am crystal clear with China that you do not make a move on that island because I refuse to put China in a position to hold an economic gun to our head. What'll I do? We'll take destroyers from the group we have in Japan, take one per month, move it through that Taiwan Strait, move a couple of our Ohio-class SSGNs, put them in the South China Sea, put them in the Pacific. This is something that actually will send a strong signal to China. They will not take the risk of making that move, especially if they know that the U.S. is only biding our time until we have semiconductor independence. That's where strategic clarity actually helps us. I'll also get India on our side, by the way. The Indian Navy, I think, can also build up if we now know that the India can be on side and firmly on the side of the U.S. to block the Malacca Strait if necessary, to block the Andaman Sea if necessary. That is where China gets its oil supplies from the Middle East. That is a significant deterrent as well. There are other elements of the Taiwan porcupine strategy, up to and including putting a gun in every Taiwanese household, training them how to use it. That's what I'm going to do, Hugh, to make sure that we don't put ourselves in that position. China will have no reason to aggress towards Taiwan between now and the end of my first term in 2028 if we show we're serious about it. But by being strategically clear that that commitment changes after we've achieved semiconductor independence, now put yourself in Xi Jinping's shoes. He has no interest in taking that risk. And the truth of the matter is, there are two reasons why China wants to annex Taiwan. One is to squat on the semiconductor supply chain so they can exert leverage over the United States of America. That's not happening on my watch. I take a firm position on that. But the second reason why is that they have unfinished nationalistic business dating back to their civil war in 1949. And if that's the sole basis for Xi Jinping going after Taiwan after we have semiconductor independence, then you know what? I am not going to send our sons and daughters to die over that conflict. And that's consistent with my position on Ukraine as well. So I hope that makes sense.
It's such a fundamental Let's help out the Chinese foreign secretary and the Chinese bureaucracy. General Secretary Xi asks, who is this Vivek guy and what did he just say about Taiwan? And they will summarize and they will provide a training. I have no doubt, by the way, that that's going to happen. They will pay attention to what you say very closely.
Oh, they already are.
So do they draw a conclusion from that you will indeed sink Chinese ships if they seek to invade Taiwan prior to 2028 and that you will go to war with them? Is that their conclusion?
Let me make it really simple. Let me make it really simple for Xi Jinping's translator, okay? Do not mess with Taiwan before 2028. Before the end of my first term. Okay, we are going to go to full lengths to make sure that you do not mess with Taiwan. We're going to move. Those two Ohio-class SSGNs, We're going to surface them, and we're going to bring them to the Pacific. We're going to bring them to even the Indian Ocean and elsewhere, okay? You're not going to like that very much because they're loaded up with 150-plus Tomahawks apiece that have 1,000-plus mile range. That could reach the Chinese mainland. So do not mess. But listen to the second part, too. That commitment is only as far as 2028, by which point I will have led the United States of America to achieve semiconductor independence. And we will not take the risk of war that risks American lives after that for some nationalistic dispute between China and Taiwan. And I think, what does that mean for us, Hugh, here at home? He is a rational actor, just like Putin can act in his own self-interest. And you know what? I think they want to get this done ultimately before 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Civil War when Chiang Kai-shek left. Well, I think that his rush to do it before 2028 is going to change when I'm the U.S. president, because I have now moved from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. And I think that is best for the U.S., and I think that clarity actually helps us avoid war.
What's clear to me is that you are saying, I will go to war, including attacking the Chinese mainland if you attack before semiconductor independence, and afterwards you can have Taiwan. So if you just wait until 2029, you may have Taiwan. Is that clear? I mean, that's what you're saying. I'll go to war.
Look, Hugh, I'm running to be the next president, and so I expect to be the president inaugurated on January 20th, 2025. So I'm wearing that hat when I'm choosing my words very carefully right now. And I'm being very clear. Xi Jinping should not mess with Taiwan until we have achieved semiconductor independence, until the end of my first term, when I will lead us there. And after that, our commitments to Taiwan and our commitments to be willing to go to military conflict will change after that, because that's rationally in our self-interest. That is honest, that is true, and that is credible.
As we speak, gathering at Camp David are the presidents of South Korea and the Prime Minister of Japan. What do you think those two countries will think of the Vivek's position?
Well, look, I think that there are elements of their national interest which would want me to say that we're going to go to war with Taiwan forever to keep Taiwan independent. I think the reality is we can be a better partner to our allies if we're honest about our intentions. And so I think moving to that strategic clarity makes our commitments more credible, to say that we're going to do what advances the interests of the United States. But in the meantime, one of the things that I favor is entering better and stronger bilateral deals, including bilateral trade deals, not multilateral, but bilateral trade deals with each of South Korea and Japan. That actually helps us achieve semiconductor independence even sooner. Samsung in South Korea, by the way, is still further along than any other country, than any other company here in the U.S., even Intel or otherwise, in making leading edge semiconductors. And so this is all part of what we're going to require, and those are wins for Japan and South Korea as well, to be able to enter stronger bilateral trade deals with the U.S. in each of those contexts.
Vivek, I applaud.
We'll be better off.
I applaud clarity, but I want to go the next step. Let's say they think that you'll fold. They assess Vivek Ramaswamy, President Ramaswamy, will fold, talks big, doesn't have the Navy to back him up. Do you think we win a conflict with China in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific? Do you actually think we can do that?
That depends. So I'm a realist. I mean, I think right now, if we take the risk of entering serious major conflict in a circumstance where Russia and China are still in a military alliance with one another, and we have not gotten India fully committed, non-aligned where India prefers to be historically, then I think we're in serious danger of not only losing that conflict, Hugh. I think there are serious threats to the continued existence of the United States of America as we know it. And I see that with plain eyes, with hypersonic missile capabilities ahead of what the U.S. has, missile defense capabilities that are badly lacking. But that is why, as soon as I take office on January 20th, 2025, one of my core focus areas is going to be to make sure that we have those defense capabilities for the homeland intact. Missile defense capabilities, talking about super EMP defense capabilities for our electric grid, take the 60 effectively Chinese nodes in the middle of that, swap them out for American nodes effectively. That's, I think, one of many important changes we need to make to our electric grid. Cyber defense capabilities. We have not focused our defense energy on defending the homeland. And so I think we can put ourselves quickly in a position, Hugh, to be able to say that, yes, we will come out on top, but we're not there right now. The other things that we need to do, the most critical, are weaken, if not disband, that Russia-China alliance. This is where Ukraine comes back into the picture. We cannot enter that conflict if Russia is firmly treaty bound to China. It does not work. And yes, you'd say, is that really a treaty? Yes, it is. It is the 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Cooperation between Russia and China that they upgraded to a no-limits strategic partnership in 2022. I think India getting on side with us is a must. I think we have to have confidence that India would indeed block the Andaman Sea, even indeed choke the Malacca Strait if necessary. That then becomes a risk that China can't take. And so I think, Hugh, with that strategy in mind, I think I'm going to be best positioned with that clarity to achieve peace, to actually achieve true deterrence, at least until we've achieved semiconductor independence. I think it's a level of clarity that nobody else in this field has offered. I think it's important.
That's true. That's more clear. Either they take you seriously or they don't, and I think anyone is crazy not to take you seriously given what you've done thus far and the field and the fact that the former president has problems that may arise. But if they take you very seriously, don't they invade during the transition?
I don't think they're ready to. That's the short answer. I do not think they're ready to yet consummate that. So Xi Jinping is still building up. The timeline they've been working on, I believe, is when we get to the nadir of our divest to invest program, our nadir of our naval capacity. I think they're currently looking right around that 2027, 2028 timeframe. So China isn't quite yet ready to take that on. I think they're biding their time to see what the results are of the Taiwanese elections. Remember, we're not the only ones who have an election in 2024. There's one in Taiwan as well. I think China's watching that very closely. And so, Hugh, it's a good point you bring up. I'm being very thoughtful because for me, I'm not having these conversations with you just wearing my candidate hat. I'm wearing the hat that I'll be wearing starting in January 2025 and choosing my words very carefully. But I think I'm sending a message that is clear enough that China will know it is not in its self-interest to actually take the chance of doing this before 2028. It just doesn't make sense because, as I said, I believe Xi Jinping is principally actually long-run motivated by that nationalistic impulse. And there's a guy who still dresses up in Mao Zedong's suits, okay? He has a nationalistic impulse and a project that he needs to fulfill sometime before 2049. Under my watch, he's definitely not going to see that fulfilled before 2028 when I secure semiconductor independence for the United States of America. That's what it comes down to.
Do you have any concern with the human rights record of Xi Jinping and your policy, if you were to be elected, having to do with Uyghurs, Tibet, Hong Kong, general repression, the surveillance society, the social credit score, or is that just going to be up to him? As part of the Vivek promise, leave Taiwan alone and we will not bother you on human rights?
Well, Hugh, I mean, you have to look at my broader posture with respect to China. I have called for us to declare economic independence from China. That's the other thing I'm going to lead us to do is significantly by 2028, weaken our own economic dependence on China. Enter those bilateral trade deals with Japan, with South Korea. In fact, I think it's a bilateral trade deal with India, akin to what we might have with Australia or Chile right now, that would be sufficient to extract a commitment in return from India that they would indeed block the Andaman Sea and the Malacca Strait in the event of conflict. So for me, this is part of a broader comprehensive vision. I think that if we're able to do that with India in particular, but also South Korea and Japan, maybe Vietnam, the Philippines, Australia included in that economic realignment, that puts us in a strong position with significant onshoring to the U.S. as well to significantly reduce our economic dependence on our chief adversary today. And you know what? If that were a Russian spy balloon flying over half the United States or a Russian spy base that they're now building on Cuba, we would immediately ratchet up sanctions. We would have shot down that spy balloon instantly. But the reason we didn't do it in China's case is because we're scared. Why are we scared? Because we depend on them for our modern way of life. And that's different from the relationship with the USSR in the last Cold War. We never depended on the USSR for our modern way of life. And I think it is shameful and regrettable that we depend on communist China for the way we live our lives today. And so that, for me, is a broader part of our vision. Do I have concerns about a lot of those Chinese practices? Absolutely, I do. But my deeper and more proximate concern, Hugh, is that Nike and the NBA and BlackRock and JP Morgan Chase and Apple, the largest U.S. companies in the world and their CEOs, are bowing down to Xi Jinping as he does it, even as they criticize Black Lives Matter or criticize systemic racism and support Black Lives Matter here at home. That juxtaposition, when U.S. companies, when international multinational companies repeatedly criticize the United States without saying a peep about Xi Jinping, who treats them like circus monkeys. He says jump, they say how high, because they want access to the Chinese market. That undermines the greatest geopolitical asset of the United States of all. That is our moral foundation on the global stage. And so that's, as a U.S. president, the deeper concern that I have is the way our own companies have been deputized as Trojan horses to undermine our own moral standing. And if you think that that's just a one-off observation because I'm a guy who wrote Woke Inc., that I'm obsessed over that, no. Actually, listen to Xi Jinping on a given day. When the UN or others press him on the Uyghur human rights crisis, what Xi Jinping says, or maybe more precisely his translator says he's saying, is that the United States is no better because of Black Lives Matter. Look at that. Look at when their Yang Jiechi, one of their top diplomats, came to the Alaska summit to face off with Tony Blinken. What's one of the first things he said in his 15-minute opening statement? He says that China wants to see the U.S. do better on human rights, and that China wants to see the U.S. stop slaughtering, those were his words, according to his translator, slaughtering Black Americans. This is nonsense. And yet they're undermining the credibility and the moral standing of the United States. And that's what's created, in part, Hugh, this diplomatic vacuum that China's filling. Look,
no, Vivek, I want to go back because I don't expect you to know the specifics of the 1964 campaign. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Are you familiar with the Goldwater-Johnson campaign?
I mean, not nearly as much as you, I'm sure of that. So this is ancient history.
After Goldwater delivered...
But I stand for Goldwater, for sure.
Yeah. Well, after Goldwater delivered his extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice speech, the Johnson campaign one-time used the Daisy ad. Do you know the Daisy ad?
I don't.
It is the mushroom cloud after a girl with Daisy. What you said about China earlier... Yep. What you said about China earlier will be, if you're the nominee, somehow you become the nominee, you will be accused of threatening a nuclear war based on this conversation against Xi Jinping. Strikes by our Ohio-class SSGNs on the Chinese mainland. How are you going to deal? How will you deal with?
We would move them. I said we would move them, is what I said. So under my watch, I want to be very clear about one thing, Hugh. This is really important, okay? I mean, we're talking about, these are heavy issues. We got to be very clear about the words we're choosing here and exactly the signals we're sending. The only way I expect there will be a chance that I become a wartime president in my first term will be if Joe Biden sleepwalks us into a major war through missteps in Ukraine. And even then, my focus will be on de-escalation and pulling Russia out of that military alliance with China. On my watch, I am confident, Hugh, that I am the president who knows how to keep us out of war while continuing to advance U.S. interests. And the number one way we start doing it is by ending the war that we're currently actually marching into, which is the Ukraine war.
I want to interrupt here.
That's critical.
Are you in real time walking back your threat about the SSGNs? You're not.
No, I'm not. I've been very clear about what we'll do. I said we're going to move.
All right, then what are you going to do with legacy media?
SSPNs. Yep.
What are you going to do with legacy media when they run the Goldwater ad about Vivek?
Well, look, I think legacy media has already been saying all kinds of false things about me. And the way I'm succeeding, Hugh, is by standing for truth, by sticking to my guns and saying exactly what I mean and exactly what I stand for. And the good news is today, and I think this is good news in the United States of America, people have a deep distrust, appropriately, for what they're fed by the legacy media. In fact, we're calling it legacy media for a reason. You and I are having this conversation, and it's not running through cable television. In fact, most of the conversations I have with the media are through podcasts or other mediums that actually go directly to people without being run through those filters. And so I think we live in an era where people, especially after the Trump era, I think this was a good thing, learned that they were being fed lies, distortions that were designed to advance an agenda. But I think our base, and when I say our base, I'm not just talking about the conservative base, I'm talking about our American base, is educated, is smartened to that fact. And so I have full confidence in our citizens to be able to glean the truth. And the truth of the matter, Hugh, is the reason that the people don't trust the government or the media today is that the media and the government don't actually trust the people back. I view it differently. I know that people can trust the government when I'm in charge, I hope, at least more than they do today, because they know I'm giving them the truth. I believe that we, the people, we can handle the truth. That's going to be the hallmark of my domestic policy and communication. It's also going to be the hallmark, Hugh, as we've talked about right now, of my foreign policy. When I'm very clear, moving from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, being unapologetic on the global stage about the fact that I, as U.S. president, yes, will stand exclusively for American interests. That actually allows other countries, even including adversaries, even including the likes of Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, to know that they can actually believe what I say, because it's credible that, yes, my sole interest is to stand up for
now,
tangible
Vivek, you are going.
that will secure peace.
You're going full Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles here, and that's admirable in my view. On the other hand, I can just see what they will say about this in the media and in the Chinese halls and in Russia, which is you'll give up Taiwan after 2028, but before that is nuclear war. My Marine Corps general friend, the retired guy, said to me, he's a pattern recognition guy, as you must be because you're a successful entrepreneur. The pattern he sees is the United States did not win in Korea, did not win in South Vietnam, did not win in Iraq, did not win in Afghanistan, and that the American people don't have the appetite nor the armament to conduct the kind of war that you're talking about. You're talking about a major confrontation, a world war. And so I'm just asking, do you really think...
I want to be crystal clear. I will be the president who keeps us out of world war. I've said that before. I'll say it again. If there's one presidential candidate who has the depth, I mean, nobody's gone into remotely this level of detail, Hugh. It's like not even close where the rest of the Republican field is. And you know, here's a funny little fact. Also, let's just call this spade a spade. I didn't know much of this 6 months ago, but the only difference between me and the other candidates is I'm the only one actually willing to admit that. I think many of them still don't know it now. And so I think this depth of understanding combined with strategic clarity actually is what will keep us out of war. And Hugh, we're having this conversation against the backdrop. We're not having this in a vacuum. We're having this at a moment right now where we are arming one side of a two-sided conflict to the teeth. The other side of that conflict is a nation that's in a military treaty with China and a nation that has hypersonic missile capabilities and nuclear capabilities ahead of that of the U.S. And so the reality is, just as it was, by the way, remember when Trump took over at the end of the Obama administration, we were marching head on to conflict with North Korea. People forget giving Trump credit for making sure that that conflict did not materialize. Well, here we are now doing it at an even larger scale with respect to Russia. Those are going to be the conditions under which I take over as U.S. president. I will be the U.S. president amongst any candidate in either party who makes sure that I am not a wartime president. That's actually the hard answer. And so if the media wants to distort that and take an opposite headline, great. Welcome to the way things work in the media. But the reality is my top job as U.S. president will be to keep us out of war. And I think I am the single U.S. presidential candidate who has the clearest vision of exactly how to do that. And I think one of the ways, a sure way to get into some kind of conflict is actually China squatting on our semiconductor supply chain, people in this country not being able to live their modern way of life. It's going to be one conflict or another, one way or another. A surer way to get us there, continue to effectively arm Ukraine to the teeth, enter a conflict that forces Russia to do something that pulls us into conflict at a time when China's militarily allied with Russia. These are things that Biden is sleepwalking his way to actually see ourselves doing.
Now, Vivek, I said an hour, so I want to honor your time. I got other things to ask you about, but you just drew a red line around Taiwan, a big, bright red line.
What time is it, Hugh? Actually, I have to ask this.
You have 19 minutes left with me.
Goodness.
Right.
Okay. I thought we were going for half an hour, so we're actually well over my time here, but I would like to continue this.
Okay, let's just go to the bottom of the hour. That's what I thought. You drew a big red line around Taiwan. President Obama drew a big red line around Syria, and he did not live up to it. I want to be very clear about this. War if they invade Taiwan before 2028 or semi-independent. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not committing to that. What I'm saying is that we will deter until we have achieved semiconductor independence. We will strongly deter until we've achieved semiconductor independence. And the way we do it in the meantime is step on the gas in terms of achieving semiconductor independence.
But so that's not surfacing SSGNs and hitting with cruise missiles. You said the mainland. You said the mainland of China.
That is deterrence. That is deterrence.
Would you actually do it?
Well, look, I think that we will never have to get there, Hugh, if we set up the circumstances, pull Russia out of the military alliance with China, get India back on our side. China will know the Andaman Sea will actually be blocked under that circumstance. And then, yes, we've moved capabilities significant capabilities. I think we'll run a destroyer one a week through the Taiwan Strait. We will move 2 Ohio-class SSGNs to the Pacific, to the Indian Ocean. We'll move them around. That will collectively send enough of a signal, combined with my strategic clarity, that the date we take seriously is 2028, the end of my first term, when I will lead us to semiconductor independence.
So, Vivek, strategic clarity has to be backed up by specificity. And I want to make sure I don't do you wrong.
I think I've been very clear about exactly what I'm going to do.
You would use force against Taiwan first. I mean, against China first.
We will make sure that we are in a position that China doesn't even come close to thinking it would be a good idea.
But if they do, I'm asking if they do.
Yeah.
If they do that.
If they do is like, what do they actually do against the context of having that much defensive capability around Taiwan, against that much of India actually being on our side to close the Andaman Sea, against the possibility that actually the U.S. is already going to be semiconductor independent by 2028.
Vivek, I don't want to hear, but do you see the relevance of President Obama and his threats against Syria not using chemical weapons?
Yeah, President Obama
and he threatened it, and he threatened. What's that?
Yeah. President Obama folded, right? So the red line meant nothing was the answer. And I'm not going to be a president who folds on commitments that I've clearly made.
So your red line is a red line.
US. I'm being very careful about the words I use right now because these will have serious consequences. I expect to be the next president of the United States. My message to China is clear. Do not mess with Taiwan before 2028. And before 2028, our commitments are strong. After 2028, we have semiconductor independence. We have very different commitments, lower commitments, significantly lower commitments to a situation in which you're sorting out a nationalistic dispute that dates back to 1949.
All right, let me switch to Iran. Well, we've got 15 minutes. I want to ask you about Iran. If Israel chooses to attack.
Okay. Hugh, I was scheduled for 30 minutes and we've gone for 45. I love this, but we're going to have to continue this, Hugh, at a different day. But I really appreciated the opportunity.
Okay. Do you have another commitment? Is that?
I do. But
all right, I honor that. We got a confused signal here. We'll pick it up another day. Vivek, have a great conversation at the Nixon Library. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.